You first became immersed in Celtic music about 15 years ago. Talk about what first attracted you to the genre.
That's a good question. um, I maintain that it sort of exists in an instinctive kind of way, that I didn't cerebrally seek out the Celtic music. I maintain that it really chose me, that when I first heard it, which would have been a recording of Alan Stivell's Celtic Harp Renaissance, and subsequently after that groups called Plankstead or the Bothy Band or Steelite Span, there was something about the modal nature, there was something about the ingredients, as well as the span of passion and liveliness about the music that I was just instinctively drawn to. So given the opportunity to try to create that or create an interpretation of that myself, I was quite excited to come across the harp and also work with some folk musicians who were already playing some of the instruments.
You incorporate a lot of modern instrumentation and production into your work. Tell me about your interest in expanding the boundaries of Celtic music.
I think because I wanted to expand on the whole themes and the imagery that a lot of the folk music can evoke, and there are a lot of people who perform traditional music with the traditional instruments and arrangements. And I think they do that very much better than I could. I'm really interested in expanding the contemporary relevance, perhaps. For example, in the recent recording, The Visit, there's a piece called Bonnie Portmore, which is a couple of 100 years old, but it's a very contemporary relevance and in terms of its environmental statement. So I'm looking to the arrangements and the instruments to flesh out that contemporary statement.
As the years went by and your profile expanded, you became a catalyst yourself for others to appreciate and explore Celtic music. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, to be a catalyst, that's one of my life's objectives. I've been inspired by many people who have, in their turn, been catalysts. No, that's great. It's quite interesting to see the waves of interest to come and go in the Celtic territory. So, as I say, if I can be that for other people, that's wonderful.
You first took up the harp in 1983. What captivated you about the instrument?
I think the imagery, boy, I use that term a lot, but there's a versatility to the harp, and there's a kind of poetry, a poetic sound about it that's gentle, and yet it has a lot of articulation, and it can be quite dynamic, and it can be quite dynamic. So you can go from being very subtle to being very dramatic with it. So I guess it would be some of that. There's a lot of things that are mysterious about it, and in a way, I must admit, I'm loath to probe too far into that mystery, because I'm fearful that is part of a human weakness, is to probe too far into the mysteries and mysteries of life, that they want to ultimately manipulate them to our own agenda and so on. So that's again a long, convoluted response to what struck me about the harp, but it is some of that.
Are you completely self-taught?
Pretty well, although I had studied classical piano for about 10 years and classical voice about 5. So I understood scales and I understood arpeggios, that when I came to the harp, I could adapt that knowledge to the harp, as well as I play by ear, which is a real bonus too, so that I could devise my own arrangements.
Talk about the balance between traditional and original music you explore on The Visit.
I've been finding it more challenging as of late, because there's a lot of the traditional material that's been very well mined. And it's hard to go out, let's say, and do field recordings in music sessions in Ireland or Scotland and find music that hasn't already been found and recorded. So, I mean, the Bonnie Portmore was a piece that I really found quite striking. The rest of the music, which is sort of original, or it comes to me, I guess, in various ways, and I guess that it's part of what the title is about, the visit. That I maintain that the creative impulse is a kind of visit. There's a sort of energy that your body, your skill becomes a vehicle through which something else happens, and I think everybody experiences that in their respective work. I'm sure to some degree or another.
What are some of the key considerations for you when arranging a traditional piece?
Well, first of all, the theme, or what the story or the lyrics are about, but also the melody. Um, it's hard to find those striking melodies like "Come by the Hills" or "The Carrickfergus" or "She Moved Through the Fair," but it would be the melody that would attract me as well. There are sometimes there are lyrics that I find really exciting, but the music isn't so exciting. For example, Standing Stones, when I found that, which is a piece off of Parallel Dreams, when I played the music, I found it in a wonderful old collection of pieces, and I hadn't ever seen this piece, Standing Stones, before. I liked the story very, very much. The music didn't do much for me at all, so I took those lyrics and set my own music to them. And so I'll do that as well.
Your recording of Greensleeves has an interesting story behind it. Recount it for me.
We began the tracks for Parallel Dreams actually in 1988, and that was through an artist development deal with Polygram. And in that session, the mandate was to come out of the studio with 4 pieces. And while we were working on one of, I think it was Samhain Night actually, the phone rang. The engineer had to chat on the phone for a while. So I was set up in the control room with the vocal mic and the keyboards. The guitar player was set up in the booth and the cellist was set up on the floor. And I said to them while John was on the phone, I said, hey, why don't we just try I want to try something with Greensleeves here. I want to send Tom Waits up doing Greensleeves. So I started playing it, and we didn't get very far. I don't think we got through the first verse. John got off the phone. He said, oh, that sounds kind of interesting. Let me just roll the tape just for sport and see if you guys can get through the whole piece. So I looked at Brian and George on the floor, and we said, oh, okay, sure, fine. So we rolled the tape and went all the way through it. So the cut that is on The Visit is a totally spontaneous thing. We never went back to fix anything. This is that moment captured totally like a photograph, as it were. And they didn't know where I was going to. I didn't even know where I was going to in terms of chord progressions or how long between verses and chorus and so on. So I think it's a special piece just for that.
Lady of Shalott is accompanied by the poetry of Tennyson. Tell me about putting that piece together.
There have been people who have kidded me about the whole drawing upon the Dead Poets Society because I've set some poems of Yeats and another Irish writer to music. What can I tell you about this piece other than it's, for those who aren't familiar with it, it really is set in the Arthurian time of Camelot. And it's an epic poem, at least an epic poem in terms of performance, because it has about 15 verses. I just like the imagery of it very, very much. There's a rural imagery that I tap into. I live on a farm just north of Stratford, and when the sun sets, I look to the west and see it setting over a wonderful field. So there's a verse particularly of the reapers reaping early that the imagery of that really caught my eye, and the whole story of it I found quite romantic in many ways. So I thought it would be an interesting piece to have in the whole recording. It would be different than a lot of other things. And again, this is something else I've strived to do with the recordings is really try to cover a wide thematic and territory, as well as the imagery, as well as the arrangements. And this was one of those.
The track Cymbaline features George Collar on sitar. What's your perspective on how Indian classical music intersects with Celtic music?
Yes, the sitar comes in because I've been very interested in the earlier Eastern influences of the Celts. Now, when people talk about the Celts, they think of, the people who come from Ireland, Scotland, or Wales. But in actual fact, the Celts were many, many tribes who, at the height of they weren't really a nation, but when their art was at its height, you might say, which would have been about 500 BC, they were an assemblage of tribes around Middle and Eastern Europe. They had been influenced by peoples who had come from like the Russian steppes, from area we now call Hungary, even North Africa. And a lot of this can be traced through the burial rites and so on. So in the title, again, The Visit, a second interpretation of the visit is a visit to these earlier influences of the people that we now call the Celts. So given that, I wanted to weave in in a very impressionistic kind of way, some of the Eastern influences. So there's tambura, there's sitar, there's udu drum, there's a balalaika.
The guitarist Brian Hughes plays a major role on your records, and he co-produced The Visit. How did you first connect with him?
Oh gosh, it must have been about 5 years ago, 4 years ago, when I was working actually with another musician in Toronto, and I had said to this fellow, I'm looking for a guitar player, and he said, well, there's quite an interesting guitar player who's just moved in from Edmonton, and we should invite him to play with us. And I think it was the Mariposa Folk Festival. And once Brian came on at that time, he's been on board this ship of mine, and at the same time has his own very separate and exciting career. And again, this is one of the wonderful things about the people that I have the great honor of working with, is that they are very strong, creative people in their own right. They're not, they're excellent, quotation marks, side musicians, but their whole creative ability and technical ability goes even beyond that, being very strong side musicians. And Brian is a pretty pivotal part in that. He's a very sensitive approach to the music. And I think this also is reflective in his own music. It's very sensitive and dynamic.
Tell me about who's in the band for the forthcoming tour in support of The Visit.
Anne Bourne, who will be playing cello and keyboards and backup vocals. And I think some people know her from her work with Jane Siberry, as well as she is doing her own solo work. Brian Hughes, of course, who will be playing guitar, acoustic guitar and electric guitar. Double bass player Tom Hazlitt, who's just moved in from Vancouver. And Rick Lazar, who plays the very interesting percussion pieces like the udu drum and the doumbek and congas and South American drum. So yeah, and he comes from a more Latin jazz world beat kind of territories. So what is exciting is that, and I come from a classical folk, so when you get the chemistry of all these people who come from rock and folk and jazz and world beat and blah, 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 it's the chemistry is really quite fun. We had a rehearsal yesterday and I walked in and said, wow, this is really great. I can listen to you guys for a long time.
The Visit is your major label debut on Warner. Did the fact that the record would have a potentially larger audience influence its direction at all?
Not really. No, the ideas of this particular recording have been brewing for well over a year. About a year ago now, actually, I spent about a week at an artist retreat in Ireland, and I remember putting down the first draft of notes of the ideas and the themes and the concepts that I wanted to encompass in this recording. So I know that there can be a temptation, particularly when you enter into a larger deal, perhaps with a major company, to say, well, I'm really going to expand my market or whatever. I'm not a very market-driven kind of person. I have a creative agenda before me, and I keep my eye on that ball and try to achieve that.
You sold a remarkable number of records to your independent label, Quinlan Road. At what point did you realize you needed the advantages of a major label?
Well, it became apparent over the past year as a result of Parallel Dreams. I'd sold just over 25 or 30,000 units of that independently. In the big scheme of things, that's not a vast number of units, but within the independent realm, I understand that's considerable. So it was apparent that the demand for a lot of things was reaching a point that I wasn't able to service. So there were various companies that had approached me, and so I spoke with them, and sort of they interviewed me and I interviewed them, and it was kind of seeking out the marriage with each other. And in this particular case with Warner, and so this is a licensing deal between my label and Warner. They're a group of people who it seemed to me really had a deep appreciation for all music and the whole concept of music. There wasn't what I would call a lot of rock and roll attitude around the place. There were a lot of very warm, down-to-earth people who had, difficult jobs to do, and yet were there for the right reasons as far as I could tell, and I still maintain that, and that's because of the music.
Do you feel the Warner deal could extend your audience beyond the folk and Celtic realms?
Well, I find the average punter on the street isn't really that concerned. They're only concerned when they actually have to go to a store and ask for the title, and just by the mere nature of being able to catalog pieces of work, that's where the kind of categorization pitfall can come, because there's no question that when I look at the people who come into my one of my concerts, it ranges all the way from new age and folk to kids who listen to hard rock and people who will be my grandmothers, and then children. I've met 5 and 6 year old children who know all the words to The Blacksmith, which is a song on one of my first recordings. So, but it is necessary I know that it's necessary first for a to catalog the pieces in a store and an industry kind of function, but also for people who are unfamiliar with my work, and if people are saying, I've heard of this person, what kind of music does she do? And then people will draw other names as points of reference. But hopefully, eventually, that in that way, that it won't be necessary.
You composed the soundtrack for The Burning Times, a documentary about early modern European witchcraft trials. Reflect on working on that project.
First of all, working in film, I really quite adore. It's a very challenging kind of medium. It's very stimulating in other ways that performing a concert or performing live isn't. It's quite fascinating to see how music affects the visuals and vice versa, the chemistry of all of that. Now, in The Burning Times, which is set in the time, the Middle Ages, when women were burned in Europe as witches, or supposedly as witches, when we were working on this film, I worked quite closely with the director, and we talked about a lot of the content of this film. When working with a film, you look at the rough cut and you try and get a feel for what the film is about, what the essence is about, the period, and so on, and try to augment. You don't try to take over the scene. You just try to help illuminate certain scenes which maybe need a bit of a push. I know there's also been a lot of controversy about The Burning Times, but that's really, as a composer, that's not really my territory to discuss, really. I like to do at least one film a year, and similarly, I like to perform in one piece of theater a year, and then do a recording and go off on tour. I find the diversity really quite exciting and stimulating. I don't think I just like to do one thing. And I know that a lot of people have said that when they hear my music, that there are a lot of images that come to their mind. So I think it's a kind of, my musical stamp, I guess, does lend itself to film work.
You've done a lot of work on behalf of Amnesty International. Discuss your commitment to the organization and why you feel it's so important to the world.
Well, these days, my contribution is primarily in that I will give a benefit performance about once a year. A few years ago, when my time was a bit freer, I participated in some of the letter writing campaigns. But it's an organization that I think is just vital to a whole concept of democracy. It's a very, very key ingredient when, people, the whole concept of people being imprisoned for their political or their religious beliefs and who have never advocated violence. We really need to make sure that people can stand up and speak in that way. That's a very important part of the whole democratic process. And so I feel quite strongly towards that ideal and Amnesty's part in that.